It was Buddha who once said, "We are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves." A lovely quote. But what happens when the mind becomes unpure? What does it take to get that shadow to return? Schim is a shadow-based platformer that releases today, July 18th, 2024, for the price of $24.99. It'll be available on the Xbox One Series X and S, PlayStation 4 and 5, Nintendo Switch, and the PC, for both Steam and itch.io. It's an alternate platformer that lets you jump from shadow to shadow, as you experience a story about a man's life and its ups and downs. The question is, will the game be able to emit enough wattage to create a strong shadow of joy, as mentioned before? Or will it flicker out before it truly gets going? That's what I'm here to find out. But before I begin, this key was obtained from Pirate PR for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? So the basic idea of Schim is simple. You're a shadow, and shadows in this world are actual living things. There seems to be a symbiotic relationship with your human, and our shadow finds himself getting separated early on, and trying to get his way back. Granted, the story isn't exactly straightforward without any dialogue here, but let's actually start our focus on the gameplay element of Schim, as it is the core of the experience, despite really relying on the narrative in the big picture. So like mentioned from the start, Schim is a shadow platformer that is level-based, and there's about 65 levels in total. Each level has you want to get to a particular area or checkpoint that's highlighted in a thick outline, which will transition you to the next level. To do this, you jump from shadow to shadow, allowing yourself one hop on the non-shadow ground to get to a new shadow. If you stay out of a shadow too long, or hit a non-shadow for a second time, you'll be reset to a checkpoint, which I'm still unsure how it determines a checkpoint at times. Wish it was a little bit more clear on that end. The platforming itself, it's an interesting change of pace from normal platformers, in both good and bad ways. The fact is, despite the fact that you're always shadow jumping in this game, the types of jumps and level design do vary reasonably to a certain extent. For example, first of all, you'll get areas that are relatively quick and involve jumping shortly from one thing to the next. In these cases, there's a natural pace that you can get to these jumps, even though you may not know exactly where the next set of platforms are in terms of the screen, but there's a calming rhythm that develops from it. But then, the game could transition into an area where you have to do some pathfinding, where you need to move the camera around and get the right light angle to be able to move around. Many of these cases will involve a longer jump that you may have to get the right angle to get the distance you need, or may involve something that is moving, like a car or a bird, to move you to the next shadow. To me, this is where the game is strongest in the gameplay area, because the natural want to investigate this world and this sort of freeform environment, despite the fact that it's really not, does well in playing in the game's natural story themes. This can lead to some challenges at times, especially when the game starts getting more creative with some of its levels, and can really make you perk up when it truly takes the concept of shadow jumping and runs with it. Levels at night with Light Post in particular stood out to me, especially when interactables were involved. You can interact with whatever you are the shadow of. On a Vespa, for example, it may honk the horn in terms of your interaction, but at night, it may also activate the headlight, which obviously gives you more shadow to work with. Sometimes these interactables aren't necessarily gameplay driven immensely. You can get a human to sneeze, for example, which may stop them in their tracks, which can still serve a purpose in time-based elements, but also does well with exploration themes in terms of this world, for the most part. However, it's when the game starts getting into a rhythm in terms of levels and not bringing out those unique level elements that Schim starts to struggle. I mean, think about all the different ways that you could use shadows and light-based elements to mess with the player. The game does do interesting things like when shadows run into each other in terms of physics collisions and where your guy ends up being, and can be fun to play with. But it also doesn't do anything with strobing-like effects that could have been fun. What about using flash rainstorms that push you to more man-made electrical lighting for periods of time? What about a rave where shadows are constantly changing? Despite enjoying myself, I felt that the game could have pushed the envelope with its design a little more. And maybe that was going to happen at some point. Because I will admit that one of the weaknesses of this game is its pacing, and how uneven it can be. There are levels that seem to drag on for miles, like to the point where I was not wanting to complete them. And then they could be followed up with 30-second levels that feel very haphazardly put together. And look, I can already see the arguments developing about the game's length and its price. That old, oh, you need 8 hours to be, of this price argument. And while I'm normally of the opinion that games are underpriced for the most part, and that argument doesn't make a lot of sense in the big picture, even I sat here and went, man, I don't know about that price point. You get a good amount of content, don't get me wrong, but it can feel like some of the levels here are just not up to snuff. Now granted, the game does do a bit to extend its life with being able to find collectibles in each level, which for completionists will be nice. And some of them are in areas that you need to explore alternate paths that aren't on the main one. And I do like that. But I will also admit that I didn't really end up caring about it. I mean, maybe there's another ending if you get them, but it felt like those items could have served a bigger purpose for something, whether it be a room to decorate with them or have some real purpose to them in the gameplay somehow. But again, to each their own. I mean, it may not be for me, but you may like it. Before I move on, one of my biggest complaints about the game, though, is figuring out where you need to go next. The game does dedicate a button to tell you where to go in terms of some checkpoint-like element. Not necessarily the ending spot, but somewhere most likely you need to get to activate certain elements, or just a general progress checkpoint. That button, however, is the bane of my existence. Sure, it'll show you where to go next, but it's going to slowly push you to where that is. And if it's a bit down the road, well, sucks to be you, you're holding it and waiting, without seeing the possible paths in order to get there. This wasn't constant, mind you, but when it did have these long elements, I was wondering, why am I even bothering with this? You showed me so little of the possible path that I could be going to North Dakota on the way there and not know it. I mean, yes, there is certain points of exploration in the game, but with the paths being so linear at times, you could end up thinking that you're going one way and then have to go back because there's no actual path to get over there. And it sort of frustrates you to the point where you're like, well, I'm just gonna jump around. And yeah, exploration, that's one of the themes of this game, at least in my opinion, but it's still frustrating. I sort of wish that the game instead just did a general arrow when you press the button of the direction you need to go, and maybe a double tap of the button fast forwards you to that area that you need to go like it does now. Not as slow as it does, mind you, but a little bit faster. That would seemingly hit both elements here in terms of being able to give the player what they would need and not frustrate them in getting into these sort of dead ends that really don't feel like they serve a purpose. Now the thing is, the gameplay in my opinion is a vessel for fun, but it's also a vessel that is attempting to tell a story through the events of the game, and the cities and blocks that you end up going in terms of environmental storytelling. And again, the game is good and bad when it comes to that storytelling through the medium that they've chosen. Sure, you get cute moments in the gameplay that tell a story, like how certain people may come together in times of crisis that allows you to move on in the gameplay. Learning about this world and what it could be and what could be the story behind certain characters is interesting to imagine, and I do like the fact that some of it is very open-ended. But I'm gonna be honest with you. I really was left confused about the game's implementation of the shadows in the story and what the relationship of the human and the shadow was, and why the shadow, in essence, should even care about the human and vice versa. I know that may sound harsh for a game that was part of a wholesome direct. I mean, it's supposed to be an uplifting game, and I don't want to spoil specifics, but let me be more generic about my frustrations with it. The game was seemingly setting up an element where the two entities, the shadow and the human, were struggling without each other. In the early going, the human definitely runs into some pitfalls. Sure, he has some good moments, but he's seemingly struggling with the world around him without the shadow. And you could say that without the shadow, he is less of a person or less of who he is. So color me surprised when the human started making turnarounds and progress without the shadow. I'm now confused. Does he need a shadow? Does he not? Is it part of him, or is it just sort of something that is along for the ride? Maybe I am looking into certain elements of this story a little bit more than I should, but I feel like that the game was obviously going for an uplifting ending when they both get back together, and I don't know if the game really earned it in the end. I wish the game played more into how the shadow, which is a being in this world, felt about being disconnected from the human. I mean, it's almost like a soot sprite. And if you know anything about Studio Ghibli's work, a soot sprite can show a lot of emotion in just having two eyes and a ball of goo/fluff. And yet, it really does feel like the shadow isn't a character in the big picture of this game, which I find odd considering we control it during the entire game. Which is weird again, because the game obviously is going for cute and aww type moments with its presentation, and didn't use it all the time that I hoped. There is something about the jumping into a brood of ducks, for example, and actually having them honk each individually that does really get the cute flowing in terms of your feelings. The presentation is focused on only a few set of colors, but does well in expressing in its animations of things like a car moving or a door being retracted, and there's a lot of effort put into small animation details, like when you grab a trash can or just throwing individual pieces of trash out. There is a life to this world. The game's presentation puts an emphasis on realism at times, especially with the lighting, and I do respect that. At least in my opinion, it was trying to make it more relatable and not as fantastical, despite moving and limiting shadows. You feel joy when small children are jumping up and down in a bouncy castle when you see it on screen. You feel sad when a guy gets fired from his job and is just sort of sulking on the way out. It's supposed to get you emotional, and the game for the most part pulls it off in terms of its limited presentation from a visual standpoint, thanks to the great animation work. Again, the presentation gets enhanced greatly when the game pulls out the stops, like having a fire raging in a building. Most of the oomph factor comes in how visually striking it is, and can leave a lasting impact despite not having the greatest amount of polygons. You really notice it a lot in scene transitions and UI elements like the little cursor jumping from one level to the next. I definitely want to see what the visual designer of this game does next, because this is probably the strongest element of the game. Sound design is strong and pointed. Hearing a car horn is direct and loud, while the bell on a bicycle is clear, yet appropriate volume. There's a good sound of getting back into a shadow puddle, and does a good feedback of, yeah, I made it on that jump. And the UI elements do have that little sound that tells you, yeah, I moved one element to the next. When there's more things on the road and a little bit more chaos, you are able to hear the different layers of sound, so that, yeah, I can tell that there's one car next to another and can distinctly hear them both. Now, there are visual-based elements to this. You will hear something fluttering in the wind, but only if you can see it, and I understand why they made this choice. They don't want to make too much confusion, even though it wouldn't make sense that just because you can't hear it and you're looking at a different way that, it's still there. It would still be making the sound. But that's for the player's purposes. Anyway, you can hear some of the sounds that I'm talking about here. As for the music, it does the job in terms of a wholesome type game, and does do well in terms of themes of exploration. But also, when it needs to be more upbeat in terms of the more stressful elements, it can pull it off. It can wind down with more sad elements, but this music is purely complimentary in my opinion. You're not going to listen to this outside the game, but it will enjoy to adding to the experience to a certain extent. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that not having it on will be immensely disabling to the experience, but it's competent and makes sense. And you can hear what I'm talking about here. So, what is my overall score for Schim? Well, this is where I have to bring up that elephant in the room. My score is a buyability score. It takes a bunch of factors into account, and there are strengths that Schim does bring to the table that really help it. The unique shadow platforming, especially in certain levels, does really well in providing a new experience for platform veterans, or newbies alike. It's a cute and wholesome type game that can really put your mind at ease in a world filled with chaos and troubles. It can get some good emotions out of you, and it did have some good highs and some good lows, which I would hope a story would have. But it also was inconsistent. It felt like the game wanted to explore more bigger things and ideas and didn't, and filled in at times that really stood out, especially towards the back half of the game, causing pacing issues. It could get annoying to find certain paths, and even with some of the fun platforming and differences here, it could get repetitive in bad ways. The story was inconsistent and felt like that certain plans were thrown out at some point. It just felt like the game could do more. And the problem that I have, not necessarily from a content standpoint, but from a buyability standpoint, is that price. Look, again, buyability is relative. Some people have more money to spend on games than others. But when I do the objective part of my score, aka the main score, I have to look at a lot of different elements in terms of the game's buyability and what you could get for that price for other experiences comparable to this one. And when I compare platforming type games with puzzle elements to the alternative platforming and puzzles of Schim, I struggle to push Schim above them in terms of buyability. Sure, not every game is a one-to-one comparison, but games like Viewfinder, Webbed, Grapple Dog, Superliminal, it's hard for me to look at a lot of the comparisons and say, yeah, going out and buying Schim at $24.99 will be something that you won't regret. The fact is, for a good amount of you out there, I think that, yeah, it would be a disappointment at that price. But at the right price, I think it would be worth playing. And that's why it gets a 68 out of 100. It's worth buying when the game goes on sale. And if you're hurting for cash, maybe a deep sale. But, that does not take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective element of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories on screen, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability rating for you. Now, in this case, there's a lot more positives than negatives. It's sort of pushing up the people that really enjoy this game and pushing them into that buyability score. Some games, they can have a good amount of people going minus and plus, but some do have a subset of people that really will enjoy this game, and Schim definitely falls into that category. Anyway, that's it for this review, and I thank you for the patience of making it all the way to the end of this review. If you liked this review, hit that like button and maybe share this video with a friend, and if you want more reviews like this, hit that subscribe button. Coming up next on the channel, most likely is a game that has already come out. Granted, I don't do this often, but when I stream games over on Twitch, and occasionally here, usually I'm just getting games for the end of the year list, or, writing a Steam review for it. But every once in a while, a game comes along that really resonates with me and makes me want to review it. And Fallen Leaf is one that I just played that really made an impression on me the first time. I still have to finish it, I still have to beat it, but I think that will be the next review. Granted, if an embargo comes along in terms of a game that's upcoming, I'll probably focus on that. But take a look in my